I think there are some phases in that transformation. The first phase is kind of getting beyond the good buy, bad buy mentality and just having a process for saying, hey, we're going to look at a broader array of ingredients. We're going to look at how to fairly value those. Smithfield system really had a great way of bringing everything back to square one and coming up with a good way to think about how we ratio prices. The same way that nutritionists might think about how you guys are ratioing nutrients or ingredients. Being able to take that and empower your buying team to go out there and say, hey, this isn't a good buy or a bad buy. This is, cookie meal is worth X percentage of corn, not this price today. Especially with the volatility in corn and soybean meal, it's really difficult to compare today's price to yesterday's price of anything. Unless you're bringing it all back to one single point in time, you're really never going to get a good view of what's going on. So I see a lot of noise, and at the beginning, there's a huge amount of noise of who called today is who you're out there trying to run these cost type exercises on, to having a formal process, to maybe that process is a little too formal, and all variants in between.
Swine it.
All right, welcome. This is Jared Purvis. Welcome to our Swine It podcast show. This is my first podcast, so bear with me. But we have a great guest today, Mr. Casey Shaw. Casey, if you want to take a minute and just tell us a little something about yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And I guess most people know me from my time at Smithfield. And these days I spend a lot of time working with kind of more various producers and various species. And so I get to see some things from the outside looking in that look a little different than when I was on the inside looking out. And hopefully we can dig into that a little bit.
Very good. I've gotten to know Casey here. I've known him for a while, and I always admired his work at Smithfield. And but kind of getting to know him a little better, and always admired his ability to look outside the lines and kind of look back and think outside the box. So I think that's one of your good skills, and maybe something we'll talk about today. Is you as a crystal. I think you've got a crystal ball that you can see things that a lot of people don't see necessarily, and have some good perspectives on the industry. So just kind of, me being in the swine industry, tell us a little something about your work there at Smithfield and how that's affected your perspective today.
Well, I was at Smithfield for about 10 years, I guess, and I got to work with Dr. Coffey and Hansen and Dr. Tommy Shipp and Dr. Johan twice, and all kinds of other doctors. And the Smithfield system is a little unique in terms of how it approaches least cost per pound of gain. But the short story is, when I started there, Smithfield as a system fed about 2% alternative ingredients. And when I left, it wasn't unusual to see a diet north of 40% alternative ingredients, which is a heck of a lot different than what I see now post Smithfield, working with folks that are using toll mills or making their own feed. There's a lot of folks that think they're really good at feeding alternative ingredients that, like, man, we got it to 8. And I think there's a big misconception or difference between what people think is doing a really good job with alternatives versus others. You've always done a really great job, and even feeding things way beyond what I would say a mega mill is capable of doing. Really progressive things like steep water, glycerin, stuff that a lot of normal dry pellet mills wouldn't even think to consider. But the world is a lot bigger than most people's monthly process. And maybe that's a good place to start is you get to work on integrated swine feed, but you also get to do some toll milling for other folks. And I would bet that those kind of monthly routines are very different. Can you tell me a little bit about how you see it?
To feed the world's growing population, the animal production industry needs to grow in a sustainable manner. Eastman produces one of the broadest organic acid portfolios in the global market and offers customer-driven swine solutions. Learn more by visiting animal nutrition at eastman.com.
Well, I think it's, I always have a conception, Smithfield, you've got all this, this buying volume advantages. But I think at the same point, you try to look for ways that you can improve cost and without changing, performance. And so that's the thing I admire with what you've done as far as bakery. I've seen that, made some very good strides there. But it's all about, like you said, your cost per pound of gain and how to lower that and reduce costs. Well, what do you think were some of the challenges as you, it sounds like, now Smithfield's moved maybe into kind of being much like a smaller, a toll miller or something, a mill that having a small mill mentality, but yet having all this vast, buying power of commodity ingredients. What were some of the challenges as you moved that system towards that?
I think there are some phases in that transformation. The first phase is kind of getting beyond the good buy, bad buy mentality and just having a process for saying, hey, we're going to look at a broader array of ingredients. We're going to look at how to fairly value those. Smithfield system really had a great way of bringing everything back to square one and coming up with a good way to think about how we ratio prices. The same way that a nutritionist might think about how you guys are ratioing nutrients or ingredients. Being able to take that and empower your buying team to go out there and say, hey, this isn't a good buy or a bad buy. This is, cookie meal is worth X percentage of corn, not this price today. Especially with the volatility in corn and soybean meal, it's really difficult to compare today's price to yesterday's price of anything. Unless you're bringing it all back to one single point in time, you're really never going to get a good view of what's going on. So I see a lot of noise, and at the beginning, there's a huge amount of noise of who called today is who you're out there trying to run these cost type exercises on, to having a formal process, to maybe that process is a little too formal, and all variants in between. But I had a situation yesterday where a customer said, hey, we've never fed anything but a 50-50 animal vegetable blend. And then how's that possible? With all the craziness with COVID and all this other stuff, surely there's been a time where that was not convenient or not economic or not something, right? There must have been a time where there was a better answer. And the answer was like, hey, this is our box. This is what we do. Don't ever do that. But then I also take like a dairy guy, they can go from really corn, traditional feed type system to very heavy local forage to lots of nutrients coming through the liquid package. Their systems can vary widely, even though they're not necessarily changing the diet a huge amount week to week or even month to month. They're really good at adapting to what's good locally. And man alive, if every feed mill doesn't look pretty damn similar in the swine industry, that maybe doesn't reflect what's available locally, and certainly not necessarily what's going to be available next year or next 10 years. That's where some of those things like you're trialing glycerin in the mixer. Where I started with Smithfield, no way. It wasn't going to happen. Where they are today, you can go from donuts to feed wheat, right? And they're evaluating all those things all the time in a very different way. And a lot of that was due to this way of looking at formulation that Dr. Jeff Hansen and Dr. Terry Coffey kind of built, that allowed their nutrition team to have really the ability to empower the buyers. And that's I think, if there was one thing that anybody could do better, it's how can the buyer make the nutritionist better at their job? How can the nutritionist make the buyer better at their job? A lot of times, as a buyer, I would say the worst thing that could ever happen is the magic dust salesman to nutritionists. There's a reason that everything gets sold into nutritionists, and so the buyer is more expensive, right? But there's also, hey, these are support operations. How do we go out there and make the system better, right?
Yeah.
I think a good example of that in fat world is, I saw online you had a recently celebrating some sow productivity amongst your team, right? I think that would be really interesting for folks, particularly in the Carolinas, where we're used to health issues being the norm. What was that PSY number? 30 something, right?
Yep. It's pretty amazing how those benchmarks change, and we just keep pushing through as an industry. But you're talking on the about your byproducts and being able to incorporate that. Did you have kind of a breakthrough moment? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of people that think inside of a box, and we've got obviously we're going to have some variability. I'm trying to remember the guy, but perfection is maybe is a big hurdle as far as improving things, because we're trying to be perfect. We're trying to get diets that are perfect, but we can live with some variability. Did you see kind of a nutritionist behind this, or some pushback?
I think the couple things. The biggest thing probably was when you start including those ingredients in the diet consistently, then the supply chain can adapt so that they can be available consistently, and it kind of builds on itself. So the jump from 2 to 4% is just as hard as the jump from 4 to 8 and 8 to 16 and 16 to 32. There's a lot of things in various levels of the organization that really need to go right. But a big part of that was, down here we have the Selma transload. Those guys do an excellent job, but look at the way that they've grown as both poultry and swine have utilized the asset, right? And all of a sudden it's available all the time, so we can use it. And take bakery meals, probably a great example in sow feeds. There was no way you're messing with a sow in summertime in eastern North Carolina when it's 100 degrees outside. You better damn not run out. If you're going to put an alternative ingredient in a breeder, better be able to keep it in till October, right? Well, that's a heck of a lot harder to do when there's not a 10,000 ton pile sitting 45 minutes up the road, right?
Yeah. But it's just got a chicken or the egg. You got to have the supply. It's important, as you said, the feed mill. Once you put something in, as sows, they get used to, especially lactating sows. You don't want to mess with that. So as you started incorporating some of these byproducts, I guess you've been able to increase that supply chain and move that forward and maybe find other alternatives. What are some of I said you were a crystal ball person. I think you got a good crystal ball. What do you think the next opportunities is in byproducts with food waste streams and what have you?
Well, people aren't going to become less wasteful anytime soon. So I think that's continuing to evolve and grow. That particular byproduct has changed a pretty good bit this year in that all of the broiler guys kind of woke up at one time and said, we're not really getting a premium for this antibiotic-free vegan chicken anymore. We're going back to feeding whatever is the cheapest way to grow a chicken. And they moved really fast, right? From north of 60% being vegan fed around Christmas time to, I would have said, about 25% by Mother's Day. So a huge change, and bakery works really well in that diet, and it's moved pretty quickly. And so more of the opportunities that I see are when pork production margins in China are really bad, see whey get really cheap. It's exceptionally cheap right now. Imported lysine had gotten really cheap earlier this summer to the point of our domestic suppliers slowing down in production. And if you look at kind of historical synthetic amino acid ratios to corn and soy, we're way outside the range on the low side as to what those synthetics would be compared to where corn and soy are today. And so whenever those synthetics get cheap, all those ingredients that aren't quite perfect start to formulate really well. So they're a heck of a lot easier to feed DDGs when synthetic lysine is real cheap, right? On a basis to soybean meal. And so I think how long will that trend last? Who knows? But for the moment, byproducts in general look pretty good when synthetics are cheap. And synthetics, as long as, maybe not good news for the forecast for pork profitability, by the way, but as long as the China situation is a serious headwind, then that kind of weighs on some of the things that they're really big consumers of, right? Lysine in particular stands out that way. And I think that's a great opportunity to say, hey, that's not a good situation. What does that mean for something else, right? A good example of that is the war in Ukraine. Awful situation. Really great for North American sunflower production. Sunflower oil demand is really inelastic and growing. And sunflower meal as a feed ingredient, whether it's on a protein basis or a fiber basis, is wicked cheap. And the acres are great. And the demand for the oil is good. And so you could feed something like sunflower meal darn near anywhere in North America today, and it'd probably save you some money. Couldn't have said that pre-war in Ukraine because a lot of that sun was being produced over there. So usually where there's something bad happening, there's an opportunity somewhere if you can just kind of look around the corner to find what's going on. But those are probably in the immediate situation. The Chinese situation makes for really great opportunities for long-term pricing and things like whey and lysine, which opens up some things like DDGs, de-oiled, any of those lysine deficient byproducts are going to be formulating really well, I think, probably for the crop year. And then sunflower meal, I think, is as long as there's an armed conflict going on over there that's disrupting particularly sunflower markets, you're going to see really good opportunities, ingredients like that. The other thing that I've seen a little bit is Chinese coming in and buying huge amounts of canola meal out of Canada. It feels a little bit like the trade war in that it's anywhere but here kind of buying. And we all watch those USDA flash sales, but we don't necessarily hear about those in Canada. And so even though the canola crop is pretty good, canola exports, I think, out of Canada are going to be really impressive. So maybe you could see some shifting around, maybe more regionally, West Coast in particular. I think you can see some diet changes and stuff over there. And then the last one that I think is maybe a longer term opportunity, or last two that are longer term opportunities, are corn fermented proteins are an ingredient that if you haven't heard about, you're going to be hearing more and more about. I think the industry statistic is they're going to make about 1 million tons of new production annually starting this year. That's a 25% yeast cell wall with a DDG that the fiber's been removed, essentially. And historically, a lot of those high pro DDGs were lysine deficient and too expensive, and not, at least in our area, they weren't in stock in Selma for you to formulate against, right? Some of that chicken or the egg type problem. You get 1 million tons a year of new production. They're coming to a mill near you somewhere, right? But they're really today priced attractively, especially within the context of that nursery diet, where poultry meal's gotten really damn expensive as all those birds came back from antibiotic-free, vegan-fed, moved back into their 58 blend. Those meat byproducts are really expensive on a per unit of soy basis. That creates the opportunity for the swine guys to say, hey, it's not just anti-vegan fed animal necessarily. It's be opportunistic in your program, right? And so I think there's a pretty good amount of opportunity in that nursery diet of, hey, on a relative basis, still a lot of people feeding a very traditional poultry meal nursery diet. Things like the pre-digested soy, corn fermented proteins, great savings opportunities there, and probably in grower diets too, as they get cheaper and more available. So those are probably the biggest ones. And then the last one is really palm and palmoline. Some swine guys really kind of on the leading edge of feeding that, usually where it was available earliest. But as renewable diesel continues to grow out, I think the current renewable diesel capacity is already bigger than biodiesel capacity, and that's just in a couple of years of grow out. And so these renewable diesel plants are way bigger than any of the traditional biodiesel plants that we ever were really accustomed to. It's kind of tough to wrap your head around, like, hey, each one of these is like the whole size of the existing biodiesel infrastructure, sucking a huge amount of that animal fat out of the diet, which we've experienced a little bit in the past couple of years with high fat to corn ratios. But what's a little bit unique now is we're starting to see some of the other fat types where it was just low FFA, bleach, fancy tallow. Now it's impacting BFT, it's impacting choice white grease. We shipped some poultry fat into biodiesel and renewable diesel for the first time recently. Historically, it's been maybe you have a biodiesel plant that could take it, but there's some of this wave of the really high fat to corn ratios the last couple of years. It was like, oh, that's really interesting, but it's not my backyard, right? Now it's starting to creep into the Southeast a little bit more than it had been, becoming a little bit more relevant. And so palm oil, I think, whether it's palm oil or palmoline or some kind of blend with palm in it, I think you'll be hearing a lot more about, certainly this coming year, but in the coming years in general. It's palm and corn fermented proteins are here to stay, I think, as long as policy kind of keeps driving us down that road.
Exactly. You made good points. It seems like we've got to be opportunist, and we've got to have a pulse on what's going on and what are some of the opportunities, and then be able to capture them. I always thought, if I had to build a new feed mill, I would have probably 10 times the soft bins. I would have, more liquid bins, and, that's, it's kind of like micros, or a closet. You got so many, you'll keep as much stuff as your closet will allow you to keep. So
that's right.
I think that's the same thing in a feed mill. There's so many opportunities we have if we have the storage and be able to segregate, those different ingredients. But as most of these, integrated meals are, they're designed more or less for a corn soy diet and for efficiency, and so they're not really conducive to moving and trying to incorporate some of these byproducts, like you say. So I think it's going to drive maybe better design, better flexibility to be able to take some of these. I'd have people with stuff like flour. They have some off-spec flour, big savings. You just got to have you got to have a bin that you can, and it's expensive to have a bin there that you don't, you just want to keep open. You're always going to have something in it. So to trying to understand what are the byproducts that you're going to get the best return on, and but having some flexibilities so when you have those opportunities, you're able to, capture those. So good point. To your point on the, I've never fed maybe as low energy diets as I'm feeding today, is to the point, the fat corn ratio. And it doesn't seem like we're probably going to ever go back to some of those ratios that we used to enjoy. What do you see that? I mean, that some of the opportunities there, soybean meal, do you think, where do you think we might see some better soy? It makes sense that we'd see some better meal pricing.
Yeah, I think there's certainly crush coming online, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's soy, right? So to some extent, the really cheap sunflower meal is a byproduct of global oils demand in general, right? Yes, a byproduct of the conflict, but also that some of those food grade oils are in extreme demand because of the impact of soybean oil on those things. So yeah, I think there's more soybean meal for sure as there's more crush. And to some extent that should ebb and flow with animal populations, but also other proteins, right? And so corn fermented protein, a good example of that. Really good demand for distillers corn oil into renewable diesel. This kind of facilitates that industry saying, hey, this used to be about taking a piece of corn, making ethanol, and having a byproduct, right? Now, don't call that an ethanol plant, right? It's a biorefinery. They're making CO2. They're making, every single thing is a product, and that facilitated what we used to think of as, an energy ingredient when you started feeding DDGs. We're going to buy it at a ratio or a basis to corn, but it's really providing some protein in the diet. I wouldn't be surprised if a traditional DDG doesn't exist in 10 years and it's nothing but corn fermented protein, where it really is, a 52 Pro product that's very consistent. I think the soybean is changing too, and it's probably a longer discussion for another day, but the protein content of soybean meal seems to drop every single year, and the guarantee drops maybe more than even the bean drops every year. And so, yeah, there's more meal, but there's less protein in that meal too.
Different
so that product's changing. Yeah.
Yeah. An aspect of thing with distillers, I've seen, we used to buy some distillers, with the oil content was, 9, 10%, even 11%.
Yeah, 12.
Yeah. And then they started spending
That's long
all
gone.
the oil. Yeah, they started spending all the oil, and now we've got products that are more like, 5%, and less. So it changed the ingredient, and it really made it tough to really get into diets here in North Carolina. So, if we were in Iowa, I had an ethanol plant right beside of me or something, it might make sense. But so I think that's to your point, soybean meal has changed, and it's not the value that we once had. We keep seeing those values drop. So yeah, it's gone
are the days of I remember seeing loads of 49% protein soybean meal in the Carolinas, particularly on a hot sour.
Yeah.
And now it's not uncommon to see some stuff, particularly in the upper Midwest, tick down that 44 range. You say, man, that's a heck of a change over a decade, right? And it seems like the trend is going in one direction.
Yeah.
So I think it's subtle. It's a subtle change, right? But I think there's some changes on what's going on with the bean. I think there's certainly some changes on what's going on with how much of our crop, whether it's the bean crop or the hog crop, is really grown for the purpose of sending to Asia. And domestic policy seems to be favoring domestic consumption, right? And somewhere in there, there's an opportunity, maybe different in each locality, but there's opportunity everywhere.
Well, yeah, I think back to Jeff Hansen always said we're farther from the corn pile. And maybe that's drive has driven some of that. You know, if we were in Iowa, you know, maybe these things don't make as much sense. But here in North Carolina, we're a grain deficit state, you know, and we could probably, I don't know it wouldn't take us long to use up all the corn in North Carolina and poultry and swine diets. So
got a hell of a crop this year, though.
Yep. I hope we need it.
That's right. But even with a hell of a crop, the deficit's still 350 million ish and growing at, I would say, 2 to 4% a year. And that's mostly a function of broiler expansion just continuing to grow, right?
Yep. You know, and that brings us to maybe another tangent there. Where do you kind of look at swine expansion? You look at poultry keeps expanding, and it looks like we're kind of in a contraction mode here in the swine. What do you think are some differences there with those? Even though we've got integrators, what do you think's the difference there, and why one industry is it maybe expands in a you know, maybe a not great commodity year? What are some of the things that are different that
they certainly have their headwinds too, right? Not unusual for the poultry guys to see some deep red margins. Somehow as an industry, they always find a way to grow. Concentration of the largest players, maybe there's a difference there. But I think what I really see as the biggest difference is from the biggest poultry guy to the smallest poultry guy, they're really tight and margin management, even when the margins are bad, tying that purchase and that sale, the commodity purchase and the product sale, to get closer in tune. In general, not to say there's not swine guys that do a great job of it, but I would say the average poultry guy does a better job of tying the timing of the purchase and the timing of the sale to be more deliberate maybe about managing margins. Not that we all don't look at that checkbook every day, but I think there's a lot more cross-functional cooperation maybe in the timing of that flat price purchase and sale in poultry than there is in swine. And that's, I think, one of those things where when you have those things tightly aligned, especially in really volatile markets, it enables them to react maybe quicker. And sometimes frequent small changes, lower or higher, take you not as far from the middle as when you're swinging for the fences, right? And so I think that's probably the biggest difference that I see between the two. It's not necessarily they don't have good times and bad times. That certainly exists. I think what I see are a lot of really small changes instead of really big changes to when can you think of a time that the poultry guys had 20% of barns in a state empty? Probably never, right?
Right. Yeah.
To some extent, they didn't build them to begin with unless they had a market. But also they seem to find a way, right? And that's just a huge difference. Also structurally or maybe biologically, an 8-week production cycle kind of naturally has that, right? And so maybe they're built to run equal a little bit easier because they're not dealing with multi-year production cycles. But I would say that if some of the breeder problems they've had, particularly through COVID, resemble a lot like the parity problems that we had in swine. Say, oh, they got it so much easier on that side of the fence. And you're like, no, they still have a couple generations upstream that they're trying to manage, that you got to breed that lady to have your breeder, right? Same thing with gilt development in our side of things. And well, you see it in your system better than anywhere, right? That there are no magic bullets.
That's right.
And I think, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just said, I think we all struggle. HPAI, they've been really some struggles, and we see that with table eggs. Everybody knows, kind of sees that when they go to the grocery store. But, to your point, the cycle is quicker, so they can take their foot off the gas or put the foot on the gas a lot easier than maybe the swine guys. But I was wondering, do you think, as far as adoption of technology, that they are quicker? It seems like they are quicker to adopt and to integrate things into their systems. We're always seems like the swine people are kind of behind the curve a little bit. Do you think that's part of maybe being able to take out some of it captures some efficiencies that maybe we're slower to adopt or more hard-headed, I guess, maybe?
There's some hard-headed poultry producers out there for sure, and some that, when it comes to being opportunistic with ingredients, are the opposite of that. But what I do think is they're pretty quick to adapt. Take like the antibiotic-free to conventional. For such a big industry to change so systematically everywhere, it's not like they all hopped on a call and said, hey, we're going to stop making antibiotic-free chicken tomorrow. Margins were driving that decision, and they really quickly adapted to what the customer was telling them. Where this morning I was having an argument or debate with Dr. Jeff Hansen about marbling and iodine value in swine, and he was espousing if only all of our loins looked like ribeyes, then American demand would dig us out of this hole, right? And say, well, chicken guys are still in trade down mode. Going to be tough to compete with that, right? And so I think there's maybe they're just a little bit better at letting the consumer pull instead of pushing. And for us, when you have these big swings in profitability, especially when the export market is red hot or grain markets go through the roof, and all of a sudden we're trying to sell a bunch of pork domestically again, we've got some swings at the system level that are maybe unique to swine. I once heard swine pork exports to China described as crack cocaine for the swine producer, right? When they're buying, there's not enough capacity in the world, and when they're not, they're not. And whenever you have such a huge difference in how much of your production is exported, there's gonna be some differences domestically too, I think, and I think that's a big piece of it. And then they've done a much better job at stealing market share from pork in breakfast and lunch, especially during COVID and since. That's not a dinner plate ribeye discussion. That's there's chicken on that biscuit instead of a piece of sausage. That's an issue, right? We lost market share in breakfast and lunch and never really got it back. And it's you can espouse whatever's going on in the export market, but pork's lost a lot of market share at home too. And so I don't know that I would go as far as some of the Prop 12 stuff as driving demand necessarily, but there is a piece of it as say, hey, let's be mindful of those domestic trends of what's actually going on the dinner plate. We spend an awful lot of time talking about biosecurity and how that sow is housed. Meanwhile, you have this new fast casual whole sector, and 17% of stuff that we eat out is fast casual today, and pork's absent from that plate. I'm pretty sure that doesn't have to do with how many square feet the sow has. Somehow we weren't on the plate, right?
Yeah,
and so
that's right.
Huge opportunities on the marketing side, for sure. I guess the challenge for us is getting from there to all right, how does that mean we feed the animal, right? Is that room for specialty programs? Maybe. Is that maybe saying, hey, we've got to be hyper focused on cost per unit of gain, as opposed to just doing things the way that we've always done it? Absolutely, right? There's when I first started at Smithfield, I always thought about pork as the middle protein, right? People would trade down from beef to pork to chicken. Today, pork is the third protein. People trade down from beef to chicken and then chicken to pork. Dr. Hansen and I disagree on that vehemently, but I think the numbers hold out that chicken is on a tremendous amount of the U.S. plate. And if we're the third protein, then we better be cost competitive at retail, right? Premium programs matter, but being laser focused on productivity, I think, is really more important than ever before. And a lot of that comes down to, hey, you gotta, as a buyer, you gotta engage the mill, accounting, nutrition. It takes a lot of parts to feed those opportunity ingredients. It takes a lot of understanding from the whole team beyond just, hey, what's the hot new ingredient? You're going to have to figure out how to make it work in your system. Sow productivity, ultimately, I think, being the biggest opportunity. Lots of things you can put in that diet. Animal that does not like change, particularly when it's hot, so it's got to go right. And
yeah,
so
that's right. That's
a lot
right.
of risk, a lot of reward, a lot of things that have to be put in place to make all that happen, right? But where is there more opportunity than going from, 19 PSY to 32, right? And from your high indexing farms. That's a heck of a lot of productivity that's more important than a penny change in the price of corn.
Exactly. Yeah, there's so many areas that, as you said, being a least cost producer, there's so many, we've got so many, wear so many different hats, and we've got to incorporate so many different groups, and we got to be all working together, and then throw out some of our sacred cows, so to speak. We're always going to make mistakes, but you got to challenge. I think that's the thing. We got to challenge our systems and challenge what we think or what's been done in the past, and be open-minded to, as you said, try new ingredients and not being afraid to make a mistake. I've made mistakes, I learn from them, you just move on, and then but you keep looking for that opportunity, and you keep trying to, improve your margins. And your point on the pork, that's true. I think we've got to figure out how the consumer is driving, what they want. We got to be able to meet what they desire. They're the consumer, but we also got to put something out there that they want to buy. That tastes good. And maybe it's education. My mother used to overcook pork, and my wife does too, and we got pork so lean, and it was just like you overcook, and it's just like a piece of leather. I mean, it's just a terrible experience, So I think there's, maybe we need to, try to bring something that's more palatable to consumer.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I grew up in the apple business, and they say, eat the first apple with your eyes and the second apple with your taste buds.
That's right.
There's a heck of a lot of truth in that, in the customer experience, that there's so many parts of the animal, right? There's so many pork products that are made from an animal, and then what you make of it when you come home makes a huge difference. And how we inspire those fast casual folks to get our product on the menu is really important too, right?
That's right. Yeah, and it's funny. My wife, I like a good pork chop. All my kids, my wife they want a ribeye or whatever, beef. But I still like a good thick pork chop. If you cook it right, to me, it's a good experience.
It's time for our famous three. An animal nutrition technology company offering innovative products and new applications for the swine industry. The combination of AB Vista enzymes, technical services, and nutrition expertise provides the industry with new opportunities to further improve production efficiencies. Fiber is receiving renewed interest due to its influence on the microbiome, and AB Vista has brought together research experts to discuss the industry's knowledge of fiber functionality and to introduce a symbiotic targeted to improve fiber digestion. To request access, contact NAM at abvista.com. That's NAM at abvista.com.
Well, very good. And you and I could sit here and talk all day. We have sometimes. But I wanted to, and one thing I wanted to add, and maybe the viewers, your wife is a pretty good golfer. I understand she played at state. So I wanted to ask you, do you go out and can you compete with her on the golf course?
I cannot. I cannot, but I've got 2 daughters, and my 7-year-old is golfing a couple times a week, and I've got hope that somebody can beat her ass. But I'm no challenge at all.
Okay, I'm a hacker myself, so I wouldn't dare get within 100 miles, of a golf course with her. So, but anyway, so we're at the point. We got 3 questions. First question, what kind of a book would you recommend? Would be about whatever topic that you think inspired you or was a good read lately?
Well, I would say Atomic Habits is older bestseller, but I revisited it recently, and I think that's really a great opportunity for us to create flexibility, I guess, in our system by habitualizing the things that we can. And so whether you get the Blinkist version or the full version, that's a really good one to revisit, and within the scope of creating structure creates flexibility sometimes. And I think that's in formulation more true than anything else, is to say just bringing all those pricing decisions to one single point in time instead of looking at a different ingredient every single day was really critical in feeding more and better and being more nimble. And sometimes there's so much noise out there that if you don't distill it down to a single point, you just never really quite get there. So that I would say within the scope of owning your own space, that's a really great one to revisit.
Okay, very good. And what would be somebody that's been impactful in your life? Maybe your thoughts there. Somebody that's really maybe been a big influence in your life.
Oh, I've got a long list of of influences there for sure. Probably one of my first bosses out of college, I worked for a private equity company, and he really allowed me to see a lot of stuff that a kid of that age or experience things that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten to experience. And that's really influenced how I've been able to view business and finance and real options in particular, and how to create optionality within the system. I think is probably one of the biggest factors today is to take what's a pretty simple cut and dry business and create optionality, and before you know it, there's margins and opportunity everywhere you look. And so,
very good. And what would you say is if you look at characteristics of a highly successful person in our industry, what do you think some of the traits that you think those individuals have?
Oh, some combination of grit and energy, right? If you you don't have grit, you're not going to get very far, but you also have to have energy to get over that inertia. And there's, in any large system, there's a lot of inertia. There's a lot of inertia in just our daily routine, right? You're not going to see the opportunity if you're not open to looking for that opportunity. And so I think anybody listening to this certainly has a passion for what it is that we do. I certainly do. But having that, my dad would always say, as a farmer, the most thing you have to have is optimism, right? Because you go out there every day, deal with the thing that went wrong. And so having that energy to really get out there and say, that's our opportunity to work the problem, right? And having that attitude, I think, is just critical to success.
Very good. Yeah, I think adversity is something that's, kind of a staple in our industry, and just being yet be able to kind of overcome and keep on kicking the can down the road for sure.
That's right.
Yep. Well, Casey, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. And as I said earlier, you're one of the smartest persons I know, and I always enjoy talking to you and getting little gold nuggets every time I talk to you, and something I can use and take back and learn from. So very good.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm sure we'll catch up real soon.